Hello, everyone. On behalf of Lacan Link Project, I would like to welcome our viewers and our guests today. Our discussion today will be devoted and will be focused on the issues that were recently brought up, not actually in the psychoanalytic community, but actually in a wider sort of intellectual context. And we speak about the institutional dimension in psychoanalysis and the role of analysans in psychoanalysis. Both questions were, for the most part, neglected so far, and that is why we find it especially important to encourage this debate and to maintain it. That is why we gathered together today, and I would like to introduce our guests. So first of all, I would like to welcome Gabriel. Gabriel Tupinambur is a psychoanalyst based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He is also a member of the research collective, the Subset of Theoretical Practice, and an author, and he's also the author of the book The Desire of Psychoanalysis, the book that was recently translated into Russian and Spanish. And it already managed to produce some resonating effect in the field. Gabriel is also the co-founder of Alameda Institute, and I would like to say a few words about that. Alameda is committed to enabling research that reveals the structural causes of contemporary crisis, and it also studies the possible solutions of the situation. Therefore, Alameda sort of provides supervision, promotion, and also supports collaboration between the projects of political activists, of organizers and other policymakers who share these concerns. And Alexander is our second guest. Alexander Smolansky is a psychoanalyst based in St. Petersburg, Russia. He is also an author of the monthly seminar called Lacan Ligbez. He was running this seminar for more than a decade, and it actually managed to establish itself as an important and sought-after event with numerous followers. Alexander is also an author of 4 books where he provides quite unorthodox and fresh solutions to certain important but disregarded issues within the psychoanalytic discipline, and also some philosophical issues as well. So here are the few words about our guests. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we actually decided to have this discussion because both Alexander and Gabriel, they managed to group the most sensitive areas within the psychoanalytic discourse that have been sort of carefully and very persistently avoided, mainly by the psychoanalysts themselves, both in their theoretical and practical work. And practical here concerns not only the individual therapeutic work with the analysans in the analyst's office, but also the space where the analysts gather together. And we speak about the institutional dimension, of course. And we talk for quite a while, not only the situation within the psychoanalytic institutions and communities was largely silenced, but it was actually unobvious that that there are certain problems and they do require a good deal of theoretical investigation. Whereas now, instead, when these issues were eventually brought up, it seems that the discussion was sort of overdetermined even, and it could not have been avoided. So in addition to what has been already said in Gabriel's and Alexander's work, we would like to maybe clarify certain things and also provide a scene where you can develop certain notions or certain issues that you brought up in your work. First of all, the very topic of the institution. So our first question would be, could we actually say that the very question of the institutional dimension is itself a problem in particular because it seems to be conditioned by the idea of crisis? Does it mean then that the question itself is sustainable and it can actually become a part of a permanent topic of the within the psychoanalytic discourse, as for example the transferences or any other issues or concepts that we constantly deal with and try to develop different solutions or different theoretical understanding of these ideas? Or the actuality of this problem of the institutional dimension, it dissolves along with the crisis that provoked its emergence. Maybe I would address Alexander firstly, because at some point Alexander mentioned that the psychoanalytic institution is actually, its default condition is the condition of crisis. And what could we say then about the sustainability of this institutional topic?
Thanks. I realize to what extent this event is tense and therefore compressed in all its parts. Therefore, I want to get straight to the point and outline a number of positions where, as it seems to me, we are in relation to the issues raised in the book of respected Gabriel. I will take the liberty of identifying what seems to me to be the main difficulty that everyone who is in one way or another related to Lacanian texts is constantly forced to face. It could be formulated as follows. Why all the splendor of Lacan's texts, the scope of their theoretical thought, doesn't ensure Lacanian communities from an impressive reduction and decline that we are witnessing since the Lacan's death and to this day? These reduction and decline are expressed in two metonymically related lines. Firstly, this is a weakening of the intellectual strength and theoretical power of post-Lacanian constructions. And secondly, the invariably accompanying this disappointing effect of institutional redistribution of power in Lacanian communities. I specifically talk about metonymy because there is a temptation to see two direct connection here. So one might ask, should there not be a connection between the corruption that accompanies such a redistribution of institutional power affecting the participants of communities from top to bottom, and the loss of the ability to develop the theoretical component of practiced teaching? Instead of this obvious explanation, I would, it seems to me, in accordance with the spirit of the book that we are discussing now, offer another hypothesis, more paradoxical, but allowing us to go a little further. Institutional corruption in communities is not a cause, but on the contrary, a consequence of a number of theoretical vicissitudes that overtook Lacanian teaching, and in a certain way configured both the Lacanian discourse and the communities formed around this discourse. In other words, something about Lacanian discourse and the way it is developed in communities is itself the cause of what happens in those communities and institutions. Having assumed this, we do not at all abandon the possibility of a conditionally materialist explanation of the structure of communities. We only believe that there is no exemplary materialist explanation, since the possibility of such an explanation must be reinvented each time. And the Lacanian enterprise obviously requires special efforts and measures to reinvention. Apparently, the definition of Lacanian discourse itself as a more than material source of what is happening in Lacanian communities is quite consistent with the spirit of Lacanian teaching itself. However, it's this teaching that we carefully question, since it seems to me that it's an absolute success of the book that Gabriel refuses to separate Lacan and Lacanians, as is too often done today in the spirit of dividing the supposedly never-erring Lacan who was right about everything, from his supposedly erring, misguided followers. I agree with Gabriel that if Lacanian discourse in post-Lacanian communities looks a certain way, then we probably have to assume that what is happening is due to the fact that Lacan laid down in his teaching, or as Lacan himself once put it, speaking about the subject of unconscious, turned out to be inadvertently allowed in, along with those that were laid intentionally. This is not about subversion, not about criticism of Lacan, but about the possibility of placing responsibility on the Lacanian way of thinking, responsibility for what is happening in Lacanian communities today. This is exactly how I see the tasked post in Gabriel's book, and this is exactly how I perceive the need of my own research, and therefore the book seemed very timely to me.
You asked about the concept of crisis. Psychoanalysts have troubles realizing to what extent what they do is forced to rely on the shaky ground of what we are compelled to call Freud's desire. We don't talk about the lack of psychoanalysis' scientific basis or Freud's personal brusque approach. We talk about what this very desire, Freud's desire, let into the world. And this letting in is not manifested only in passions that psychoanalysis inflames. However, these passions and impetuousness is striking. Practicing psychoanalysts are well aware that the madness provoked by psychoanalysis is quite real. It is also manifested in the new order introduced by psychoanalysis. We also know that to some extent, Freud couldn't handle this order during his lifetime. First of all, he couldn't handle the form that psychoanalysis acquired at the level of conjunction between the analytic knowledge and the community shaped by it. It is something that Freud himself didn't seem to be ready for. And in this sense, there is no doubt that it was precisely something that he desired. I mean the desire in the familiar Lacanian sense, as a stressed opposition between what the subject imagines she wishes for and what all her efforts are really focused on, which can be judged from the results of these efforts. The results of Freud's activity are astounding in all respects. But there is one dimension that is often underestimated, whereas Gabriel's book captures aptly. It's Freud's creation of the psychoanalytic community, the community of psychoanalysts. This community, as we know, is very problematic, considering that its implementation is always conditioned by the discipline and practice. That is aimed, if not at relieving human-speaking beings from crisis, but at least to introduce some restraint in their existence. In this sense, there could be distinguished two types of crisis inherent to psychoanalysis right from the outset of its existence. We could also refer to it as the two sides of the same crisis, a two-sided crisis. One of its sides is the very condition of the psychoanalytic communities, in particular the speeches and statements produced here, where it's impossible to distinguish a nominally professional side from the most informal backbiting and gossips. At the recent meeting dedicated to Lacan and beyond, I suggested to highlight and make the object of interest the real discourse of the analyst, by distinguishing it from a highly idealized formation that is offered by Lacan and the other side of psychoanalysis. The real discourse of the analyst shouldn't have anything in common with the ideal purity and selectivity of statements presumed by the ideal discourse. I would even say that it's the opposite. Yet there is no doubt that we talk about the discourse here. We can identify it. It is presented in the flesh in the Lacanian communities. In his book, Gabriel provides numerous examples of this discourse, and I find this the most precious part of the book. And at the same time, it's extremely funny, because on my own part, on many occasions, I draw attention to the same common points boosted by those who call themselves Lacanians. The endless wrestling with the same questions, the special female jouissance, the unsymbolizable real, the insidious psychosis and its endless masks. At the same time, these discussions, that at first sight seem to be purely theoretic, cannot be separated from the speech canvas in which they are woven. As a rule, it's a judging canvas, the condemnation of other psychoanalytic schools or psych practices, the condemnation of colleagues who don't seem to be sufficiently devoted to Lacan's or Miller's direction. In this sense, the psychoanalytic theory is never pure enough. In accordance with Lacan's tradition, this theory's act of enunciation, the additional intentions inherent to speech, do not coincide with the speech content. This is precisely how the real discourse of the analyst looks like, and its crisis character leaves no doubt. But there is also another side of this crisis, that also originates from the historical beginning of the psychoanalysis. It's Freud's demonstrated impossibility to reconcile with the fact that the psychoanalytic community functions precisely in this way. It's not just his personal attitude. We presume that this side of the crisis is the most problematic and gloomy one. It was not a secret for his biographers that Freud's intolerance to the picture that he witnessed among his colleagues and followers aggravated the situation so seriously, as Freud's intervention to the community, the protest against its conditions that he repeatedly declared, eventually sealed the states of affairs once and for all. It is precisely the indistinguishability of the personal and the theoretical noted by Gabriel in the desire of psychoanalysis. It's not a situational indistinguishability that can be explained by some social or psychological reasons, but the structural basis of psychoanalysis per se, the consequence of the intervention that being a practice it presumes. This strikingly resonates with Ernst Jones' words from Sigmund Freud Life and Work. Jones writes, "It is to be hoped that these preliminary remarks will have prepared the reader for the fact that the dissensions concerning psychoanalysis are even harder to resolve than those in other fields of science." Jones doesn't explain this. To be more precise, he provides a psychological explanation. Jones presumes that the very intimacy inherent to psychoanalysis, the subjective involvement that is a distinguishing feature of this profession, provokes specific reactions between the members of the psychoanalytic community, forces them to behave in a certain way. It's a very popular explanation, especially easily accepted by the psychoanalysts themselves. The latter constantly claim that it's precisely the subjectivity of psychoanalysis that makes it a especially effective instrument. Curiously, this explanation is nothing like the psychoanalytic statement. It's rather a humanistic or existential one. I mean the respective philosophy and its spirit. I think that the real success of Gabriel's book and what resonates with my own research is the possibility to point out that the functioning of communities requires a special theory. In other words, it's not a territory where we can verify these difficulties by standard psychology or sociology. In order to explain them, we may need a certain supplement, a special contribution. And what ties our hands is the circumstance that apparently should make this task feasible to us. Namely, the means to explain this functioning of the psychoanalytic institutions have to be drawn from psychoanalysis itself. Of course, not only from psychoanalysis as such, this may require additional disciplinary infusions, for example, the linguistic or the mathematical one, but apparently the fact that we still remain on the psychoanalysis territory is probably the main obstacle. In other words, how this supplement can be drawn, what could be taken from psychoanalysis in order for the community to think itself. To answer your question, I believe that we have to talk about the crisis in terms similar to what Heidegger says about the technique. We don't know what the meaning of this crisis functioning is, whether it impedes or interrupts the analytic quality of psychoanalysis, its psychoanalytic essence. It's quite possible that there exists an underside of this crisis that is a crisis itself, and this underside involves the possibility of the psychoanalytic community to think something in itself. In fact, there is something that can be a true crisis today, because as long as the community doesn't think itself, it still can function, or at least exist nonchalantly. So it's rather the absence of crisis, or the crisis that hasn't happened yet, or can't happen, that is a crisis. Thank you, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Gabriel, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Sure. First of all, I wanted to really thank you, Eugenia, Alexander, and Oksana as well for making this conversation possible. I'm saying this because I think it has to do with my answer to this question as well. Recently, I was discussing this exact matter, the issue of the conceptualization of questions concerning the institution or the organization or the status of the community of analysts and the period of crisis, and what's the relation between these things. And one thing I realized is that the way I would like to approach this is by dividing 3 layers that are important to consider, and because one determines the other. And the first one, which I think it's the most important, it's also the most fragile, and I think that it could be called the political layer, which is the fact that for one reason or another, there has been an increased aggregation, an increased connection between people and groups and discussions concerning a certain discontent inside of psychoanalysis. And I think that the very fact that we are talking here says something about that. I was even speculating, why is it that the places where this discussion is happening, why is it that it's appearing in places that are not necessarily the canonical sites for analytic discourse, especially Lacanian discourse, even though Brazil is a very dense country with Lacanians, the places where these conversations are happening in Brazil are not the big schools, the big institutions. It's not necessarily in the southeast where Rio and São Paulo are located, which are hegemonic wealthy cities. It's also happening in other places. And I think that there is something interesting to consider at that level, which I say has to do with this political accumulation of debates, interests, which has a specific form. It's not a conversation about the end of psychoanalysis, about overcoming Lacan, about criticizing psychoanalysis in its totality. It's about where is novelty going to fit into psychoanalysis? Where is the daily experience of analysts going to fit inside our theoretical account? How are we going to deal with what Alexander called the real discourse of psychoanalysts? So why is it appearing in the places that it is? Why these countries? Why these people? And I think that it's, at least in our, I'm not sure if you all agree, but I do find it interesting that both Russia and Brazil have a very particular history to deal with, which is not simply, for example, the issue of criticizing the failure of the left, but also a very special relation to the failures that come from the success of the left. So that type of problem, we have succeeded, but because of that, we failed of what came afterwards. We didn't sustain something. Something was corrupted. Something was destroyed from inside a good idea. That's a different thing than the simple assessment that an idea was a bad idea and it should be dismissed. And I do feel that there is something to this movement, if we will, that has the form of recognizing the validity, the importance of a thinking, of a practice, and wishing to continue, wishing to develop, wishing to think more, wishing to recognize the reality of that practice and not be lost or caught up in the illusions that partial success can produce. Why am I starting with this dimension? Because I think that if you don't have this, if you don't have a growing group, a growing conversation, that doesn't matter if it is small, doesn't matter if it is mostly invisible to the public, but without that, it is hard to publicly acknowledge what we've called a crisis in psychoanalysis, because no one alone can face a collective problem. And that leads us to the second level, which is the historical level. Alexander posed this question of the historical reduction or historical decline of psychoanalytic thinking, Lacanian thinking, after Lacan's death. And I do think that it is the second dimension of this problem, which is that after Lacan died for a decade or two, it looked like the door that he had opened, and that Alexander talks about a lot in his very generous afterword to my book, which I also hope to publish in Portuguese, his words as soon as well. This opening Lacan brought up of publicizing, socializing the discourse of psychoanalysis. For a decade or two, it seems to me that we could take advantage of that opening and that momentum. And it looked like psychoanalysis was not so much a defensive discourse, but it was a discourse to affirm that psychoanalysis had something new to say, and that novelty could be felt in many places. So for a decade or two, the expansion of the institutions going through other places in the world and the public debates all pushed in this direction of something progressive, if you want to call it like that, something that was about saying, this is new, this can solve problems that we couldn't solve. But after a while, it became clear that something was changing. And I would say that the 21st century slowly showed us that that momentum was emptying itself out. And Lacanians, when confronted with transformations in culture, transformations in society, the return of politics to the forefront with a new feminist movement, a new Black movement in international space, new discussions about socialism, about the financial crisis that the United States produced after 2008 on the world, critiques of war, critiques of many things that returned to the stage, suddenly psychoanalysis started looking more and more conservative. Rather than going to places to affirm it had something new to bring, it was protecting itself from novelty, afraid that its own ideas would be corrupted and dismissed. And when it does engage with other fields, it always feels like it's bargaining, as if I'm allowing to concede this one point to you, to political discourse, to anti-colonial discourse, to Marxism. I'm gonna concede on one point on condition you allow me to be what I already am. That's a much more conservative position. And conservatism is not a stable position, which also means that once you become more conservative, you almost always also become a bit more reactionary, which is not just protecting what you have, but wishing new things to go away. And this can be felt not necessarily in the caricature that Jacques-Alain Miller became. I really hope nobody here goes to his social media accounts because they are terrible. But in the institution as well, in the very silence of analysts in certain topics, or the agreement with more reactionary positions that have become more and more often, not necessarily politically reactionary, but more generally reactionary in the sense of reacting negatively to the appearance of new things you don't necessarily understand, that are not necessarily mature, because new things often appear in an immature way. They're still developing, so no patience for that. So that's the second level. And it's at that point, I think, of that turn, the transformation of the Lacanian momentum in the 21st century, that I think that this underlying movement, this underlying political conversation, political in the sense of a collective conversation of people who partake in different ways in the same field, no matter if as analysts, intellectuals, doesn't matter. Those two things interact. So to me, the conversation about institutions, about the shape of the Lacanian field, the practices, the real discourse, I believe it is an effect of a political interpretation of a historical moment. Now, this leads me to my second point, which is something I also started thinking about more recently. In the book, I start with the critique, or almost like a passing remark about something that would be cyclical in Lacanian psychoanalysis. The idea that every 20 years, 18 years, we've been seeing a similar moment of a critique of the Lacanian community that is then responded with casting aside of those who are critiquing it somehow. And the idea of a cycle is very much connected with the idea of a crisis, right? In Marxist theory, crises, economic crisis, social crisis, and economic cycles, they have a relation. The idea that when you reach a limit with a certain mode of producing things, you sometimes need a new business cycle, a new technological cycle, a transformation that allows things to remain the same. And I do think that the idea that if nothing happens, if our conversation, if the very power, why not, of this underlying conversation doesn't allow the field to change, the relations to shift, the tendency is that we're going to have another cycle. How could that look? That could look something like institutions becoming mildly interested in these topics, inviting Alexander, for example, to talk paying their dues and say, okay, we've listened, go away, and nothing changes. But now we cannot say that they weren't interested. So there are many ways, and I think that writing comparative texts, Lacan and whoever, organizing seminars to make sure that people are heard, all those things help to create a new cycle where nothing changes. So I think that that crisis is not necessarily the good way to think about this, because the only thing that makes a crisis into a point of change is if there is a power with a capacity to interpret that crisis as a point of opening. It's nothing inherent in a crisis. Crisis can be a moment of a cycle, of a restarting, a reintegration, an absorption, and of continuation of the same. So I have the impression that, as Alexander also mentioned now, there is something about the way that psychoanalysis thinks crisis that is also something that we should be suspicious about. Because if it is true that psychoanalysis for a moment represented in the social sphere a moment of disorientation, an opening to something new, this was not because of something essential or inherent to the practice or inherent to Freud or inherent to the ideas. Everything historical is relative, meaning if you are in a late Victorian society and you say the things that Freud said and his students and colleagues said, this is going to be very disorienting. Just think about the fact that even though Lacanians are often very distrustful of the idea of suggestion in the clinic, of giving an interpretation that has a content and a meaning, Freud used to do it all the time. Freud used to tell their patients, your leg is not working because you don't want to take the next step in your life. If a Lacanian analyst said this today, they would feel so guilty and like they didn't live up to the desire. But this is relative. In the context of that situation, that society, to make a statement like that, that has that meaning, is meaningless. So it's relative to that context that that statement was an opening and disorienting and creative. Regardless if taken out of context, it looks like a suggestion, a countertransferential suggestion, giving meaning to the real. That's secondary. When you analyze things historically, you need to consider both the intervention and the place that you're intervening. So when we treat psychoanalysis as being always in crisis, always producing disorientation, it's hard to ask the question about the site, the historical site it is intervening. And I think, again, Alexander's work showing that there is a very important thing that Lacanians need to consider, which is the social dissemination of psychoanalysis as a discourse, changes the historical site of intervention. And to say something meaningless can be meaningful today, for example. And to behave like a French psychoanalyst amongst French-inspired analyses can be exactly what people expect. So we should be suspicious of the trust that we have as analysts in the idea that we either are good with crises, we inhabit them easily, or that's something we're always bringing about. Because sometimes it's just a way of hiding a cycle and a restructuration and a continuation of something which is just corrupted or not working very well. And even worse than that, even if it is true that within clinical practice, there is a often productive dimension of a crisis of meaning, a crisis of behavior, a crisis of understanding, are psychoanalysts really allowed to borrow that personal crisis from their patients, to then claim that their field is doing well and that it is dealing well with crisis, or that it's everyday space. I don't think psychoanalysis is in a crisis in any deep sense. On the contrary, I don't think it's been as well adapted to the world since it was invented. Today, it is very, very well established comparatively. So that's my second point. My third point is that I don't think, therefore, that the problems of the community, the organization of analysts, the social dimension of psychoanalysis is something that is coming to the fore because of the crisis. I would even say that just claiming psychoanalysis is in crisis has been a way of avoiding those questions. Those questions are coming to the fore precisely because conversations like the one we're having here, which are not conversations of crisis, on the contrary, are conversations of a gathering that makes sense of things that were not making sense, and that are oriented towards creating an even larger conversation, of getting more people involved. And that's the type of thing that I think is bringing these ideas to the surface. It's not that they weren't around, but that to have a social effect, you need a social form. It's not enough for people to individually think these things. And so this is my last point, which is, well, but if we're bringing these ideas to the fore, if we're having these conversations, are we having a conversation from the inside or the outside? Are we talking about a concept that is coming from politics, in the sense of political organization, collective organization, social relations, and so on? Or are we looking for a new analytic concept, a concept that will be integrated into metapsychology, into the theory of discourses, into the theory, Lacanian theory in many ways? I think that there are good examples in other fields. Scientific communities, they have a scientific concept of community because experiments need to be repeated, and the conditions for repetition of experiments are part of what defines a scientific experiment. So ideas like margin of error. Why do you need to add the margin of error to a scientific paper? Because that's a signal to other scientists about measuring devices that they might use. That's a scientific concept, margin of error. Do they need a scientific theory of how people organize in general, and of people's desires or concerns or challenges with management, democracy, equality? No, they can, at those points, lean, and they should lean more on what politics has to say about those things. So you will see, for example, great scientists like the physicist Lee Smolin publishing a book about why is it that certain theories get more funding than others. That's not a scientific book, but it's a book concerned with producing effects on science. So I would say that that distinction is useful for psychoanalysis. There is definitely a need to understand how our own concepts should have something like the margin of error, parameters that are directed to the analytic community and that connect the desire or the commitment to novelty to the commitment to other people's clinical experiences. That's a challenge for the future. I don't think it's solved. But we also should be humble to admit that sometimes we should just learn from the fields that are actually immediately concerned with how institutions exist, how organizations exist, what are their challenges, what are the illusions they produce. And we should lean on them not to produce political effects alone, but we should lean in order to find out how to produce better analytic effects, how to get those problems out of the way of further development. To conclude, just a final remark, I've used in the book a lot this particular concept of institution. I'm not 100% happy with that word because I think it is easily confused with a formal aggregation of people, like when we say research institute, right? That's not what I wanted to focus on. So I ended up using institution, community, organization in a kind of vague way. But what is the thing about institution that is good as a concept? I think that the best thing is to compare institution to constitution. When a people create a constitution, you create something, you have the power to dissolve. If the peoples create laws, it's usually in the law that there are ways of changing the law. And therefore, you can have new constitutions for countries. But if you see, for example, the institution of money, the institution of the police, the institution of schools, it's much harder to dissolve the police than it is to change the constitution. Because when you institute something, you create something that you don't control, right? Constitution means you are caught up in what is instituted. Instituting something means that there is some change, but what happens after that change might be out of our control. So I think that's a useful idea, because I think it's also something I recognize in Alexander's work, that there is sometimes the need in psychoanalysis to take responsibility over what we have instituted, in the sense that we've put into circulation some things. And we can sometimes benefit from the fact that these ideas are circulating regardless of reality. In Brazil, the police works like that. It was instituted. There is a discourse about the police, but the reality of the police is very different. And it also means that we can strive to produce novelty, new cuts, new historical moments, without the desire to control those moments. That doesn't mean you're looking to control the theory, looking to tell people what to do. So that's something I find interesting. The idea of institution is a combination of social organization with not necessarily having control over what's being done. And I think that the institutional analysis of psychoanalysis, very much like Alexander also spoke of, lives with that division between what we unleashed in the world, what are the ideas, the cultural dispersion of this, and what is the reality of the practice, which doesn't necessarily coincide. So yeah, I spoke too much, but thank you for the very good question and for Alexander's comments, which also inspired me.
Thanks very much. And you actually touched upon several issues that we more or less prepared for the discussion. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about and maybe to clarify is actually the question of whether we can deal somehow with the things that we are talking about today here. And in this way, I have a question to Alexander. In your afterword to Gabriel's book, first of all, you said that in order to formulate the role of analysans, we have to admit the fact that they are already a part of the community. And in this way, we can, as you just mentioned, Gabriel, we can sort of interchange these concepts, the community, the institution, the organization. It all seems to refer to the same thing. And in one of Alexander's recent interviews, he mentioned that the analysand has also the knowledge about something that the institution itself does not know about itself. And in this way, it can be sort of analyzed as a subject of its own, precisely from the side of the analysand. And that is why our question would be, is it actually, what could you say more about that? And it also relates to the way Gabriel puts this thing, then he deals with the way they try to analyze these things when they talk about the institution of organization with the subset of theoretical practice. But maybe, Alexander, if you have something to develop on the idea of the analysans analyzing the community.
Yes, thank you for this interesting question. In fact, in the afterword to Gabriel's book, I touched upon a question which eventually led to a special conceptual formulation. It's the question of access. I could comment what Gabriel said earlier about the conservatism inherent to the psychoanalytic communities, the conservatism that on the one hand subverts them, but on the other hand can deepen even more. I guess that the psychoanalytic communities, as well as psychoanalysis itself, even though it's indeed quite often reproached for conservatism, is not conservative as such. In other words, it's not some initial, inscribed political preference, but something that leaks from what I named the question of access. Precisely because the analysts have to solve the question of access in a conservative way, they have to fence off. They can choose the same position in other politically oriented questions. In other words, what I can see here is what following Lacan we can call acting out. There is no doubt that the psychoanalyst can have a political position, but there is something that inscribes her into politics from the side of psychoanalysis as such, the way psychoanalysis is organized, and the way the access is distributed among all the participants of the procedure. Having said that the analysan is the part of the community, I wasn't solving the question of admission. In other words, it's not about granting analysans some mandate, for example, opening for them something that the institution meticulously hides from them, supposing that the analysan cannot take it, or she's not supposed to know it because it can destroy her analysis. I concentrated on asking what the access as such means, how the access can be thought by the psychoanalyst. What's never questioned in analysis is actually the access, what it means to have access to analysis. And this question, of course, is in tune with the question raised in Gabriel's book. I made a series of assumptions concerning the way the analysan acquires this access. Beyond the access that can be granted, the analysan finds other ways. It's well known that what is deliberately kept at distance, what is not allowed to be approached, according to the logic revealed by Freud, in one way or another finds the strength for the opposite movement, for considerable resistance. It seems that it's precisely what Freud was writing about when he analyzed the resistance. It's not without reason that he chooses the image of the auditorium or the room that cannot be entered, but some content still break into it. This content asserts itself the more brazenly, the more distance is maintained with it. It's precisely what the analysan does. She arranges the access to the community, relying on the only thing available to her. This is the data that can be delivered by her own analyst. I named this data the anxiety, registered by the analysan. In fact, my afterword is a bit longer because it's a chapter of the book that I am working at right now, and the publishing house asked to shorten it, otherwise its scale could indeed become quite immodest. That's why, unfortunately, some part of my text wasn't released. There I provide a detailed analysis supported by clinical examples of how exactly the analysans arrange their access, and how they handle the data about their analyst's anxiety. In other words, what exactly they detect in the analyst's attempt to realize their clinical ego ideal. The ego ideal can be undermined or weakened in the community, and the analysan is also sensitive to this detail. Besides, I think that is precisely what enables her relations with the analyst and analysis as such. This under no circumstance should be confused with another popular idea, that some sort of humanness is required for the analyst. The analysis is made possible for the analysan due to the fact that she sees something subjective in the analyst, something personal, some personality. I believe that it's not just incorrect, because I agree with Gabriel that analysis is a constructed situation. It's even twice artificial. Nevertheless, it's possible to accept that the analysan is kept in analysis by something that she gets from the analyst, but it's not something humanizing or personifying the analyst. It's the institutional anxiety. It's the analyst's institutional position, the place she can occupy in the community. I also insist that this is what attracts the analysan's curiosity. Of course, the analysan is curious about the analyst's personal life, whether the matrimonial place next to her is free, but anyway, what interests the analysans to a much greater extent Even if she doesn't demonstrate it, and even if she doesn't suspect it, it's a specific subjectivity of the institutionalized analyst, the analyst belonging to some school or any other community, since, obviously, these communities shouldn't be strictly official. As soon as there appear several analysts together, there emerges a specific real discourse of the analyst that I mentioned in the first part of our talk. At this point also emerges a specially tuned, sensitive analysant's ear. In other words, analysant's conclusions are extremely far-reaching, and it's not surprising that if they dare to voice them, for example, during the session, it provokes something really special in the analyst. I believe that it cannot be reduced to what is traditionally considered to be transference. It's not just a matter of installing a specific relation between the analyzing and the analyzed subjects. If the transference takes place, and I also agree with Gabriel at this point, it covers the entire institution. It's the transference of the analysts themselves on their own community. That's why analysis is such a problematic place, and it could be one of the answers to the question why the psychoanalytic community is such a fervent, always heated place. Paradoxically, what should be resolved in analysis, the transference as such, is never resolved here. Here I see the problem of becoming the analyst, the problem of the didactic analysant, of the one who is about to enter the field of psychoanalysis, is the fact that something in her will remain forever unanalyzed, and it's precisely her relations with the community. In this regard, even though it's considered that the didactic analysis should be more intent, however, it's been said many times that there should be no difference between them. I point out a special difference. It refers to the fact that the didactic analysant has less chance to be analyzed, because something that was shaped in her by the community will never be analyzed. The analysts have to function from this position of unanalyzability. This is particularly difficult, and to a certain extent it explains a somewhat unpleasant and stale atmosphere in the analytic communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Actually, the transparency issue is something that we would like to talk about a bit more, and that was one of the that we would like to address to Gabriel. And because, of course, when we talk about the institutional dimension, and community, it obviously presumes talking about the political dimension, which means the way people get together, the way we organize, the way people get together, the way people make common choices, and or they have to confront disagreements, and perhaps they face the necessity to find some common solutions. And for Gabriel, the very conjunction of psychoanalysis and politics was the starting point of his analysis. Of his analysis in the book. So he detects how, under certain conditions, the overlapping of these two fields could lead to serious malpractices that are not so easily registered in this very field. And then furthermore, Gabriel, you talk about the transference mechanism as that could be helpful in finding this alternative solution for political organizations as well. And maybe you could clarify this at this point for us.
Sure. I also wanted to comment on Alexander's point, because I think I learned a lot from his afterword. And one thing that he said now that I think it's very important, I mean, it's a point of clarification that I think it's very important when we're trying to make that delicate distinction between the politics of analysts, the politics of psychoanalysis, in the sense of transformations and discussions concerning psychoanalysis, and the politics in the sense of the political positions more broadly, which I don't think are really at stake in what we are discussing. But one thing I learned from his text that I think it's very important is that if we can use that classic term of dialectics to talk about how sometimes an opposition can be reflected into each term, it's interesting that in a certain way, I'm not sure if Alexander would agree, but my impression is that in the book, I try to focus on one side of the issue of what is common to the analytic community. So if there is any connection between community and commonality, I try to raise the issue of what is common to analysts and analysants from the standpoint of the analytic process to become an analyst. So that's why the focus is novelty, and from that standpoint, as I mentioned, a possible name to communities insofar as they are trying to bring about something new is the institution of something. And then the challenges concern how do you find the place of this commonality, of these novelties that concern everyone in psychoanalysis from within the analytic process, which is thought to be very asymmetric and centered only on what is new for the analysant. So how do we find, through the issue of the common, what is also new for analysts? But as I said, there is a dialectical issue, which is that we can take the opposite route, meaning we can, which I think is what Alexander is also doing in a very interesting way, which is not to look necessarily for the issue of the common in connection to novelty, but to look at the analytic community from the standpoint of the already existing commonalities between analysts and analysants. And in that case, it's less a matter of training, of paths, and therefore the challenges of rethinking transference, rethinking the end of analysis, but it's the issue of the relations, the common relations we already established, and that we sometimes negate that they're there. So to me, it is very, very fruitful to approach this problem exactly as Alexander put it, that in a certain sense, the standpoint from which one can think what is being negated in the analytic community is more often than not the standpoint of analysants. They are the ones, and we are the ones, because I'm also an analysant, who see that there is a pretense obscurity, that it plays a role, that it is maintained by schools who are trying to control the form and shape of access, even though the discourse about access is different and it doesn't represent or symbolize these practices. And I think that it is a very important way to think about it, because it would be very different to claim that the analysant is excluded and is aware of an exclusion from what Alexander said, which is that analysants will find a way, meaning there is something real about this commonality, because it will always return. If you try to obscure it, people will see the obscurity. If you try to remove yourself as a person from the analytic setting, people will see that removal. It cannot be negated without producing something. So this is a situation we have to deal with. It's not just an issue of democracy or an issue of being more egalitarian. There's no easy solution. It is a predicament where it does look that the way the practice is structured today, the way that analytic communities are structured today, they have this consistent blind spot that they need to break access, but this is itself a form of access, that they are teaching people how to behave, they're telling people how to speak, and they're also telling what to be spoken in private, at bars, conversations, when people are actually saying what they think about psychoanalysis and so on. So I find this to be an investigation in the exact same spirit of what I'm concerned with, but from the standpoint of this dialectical dimension of common things. Common things, they are both the site of relations and the site of new things. And I feel like I'm overly emphasizing the issue of novelty, which could not be really thought on its own without also thinking the issue of the relations that are. So this is also, I'm saying this because it connects with the issue of transference, because we should then start asking ourselves, what are the types of relation that psychoanalysis is ready to admit to exist? Both immediately in the sense of what are the concepts of relations we have, and we pretty much have either imaginary or symbolic relations to talk about, because we even define the real as if it is precisely the place where relations are lacking. So both the concepts that we have to talk about common relations, and second, the mechanisms that Lacanians have to facilitate negating the thinking of these more practical everyday relations that analysts and institutions establish with analysans and so on. I do think that when we look at the issue from that standpoint, and it's a very long history, in fact. I mean, there are very funny texts about how should analysts, these days nobody writes them anymore, but in the 30s, 40s, there were a lot of, especially British psychoanalysts writing about how they should dress at the office. Should they always use the same clothing? Should they remove any personal photos from their offices? It's an interesting thing because the popularization of psychoanalysis, I mean, it was already an issue in Vienna, because if you look at the size of the community that was interested in psychoanalysis, it was so small that clearly everyone knew everyone. So the idea that you could actually preserve that separation, that mystery of the analyst, that removal of the analytic community from the world is very strange that we even thought of that. Because how could it be kept in the elite, the cultural elite of Vienna, where people knew Freud, knew who his disciples were, knew gossips clearly about their life. Freud would mess with people's lives and push people into marrying friends, daughters of friends of his and things like that. Then in France is the same, where people would go to Lacan seminar, then be Lacan's analysans, then also know a lot of things and so on. So it's even a matter of perhaps inverting the cause and effect, exactly, I think, as Alexander is proposing, and perhaps thinking the dynamic of access and the very purposeful and continuous blind spot that analytic communities reproduce regarding what information circulates and what information doesn't circulate as a response to an underlying common space that probably was always there, probably had always to be managed, and we're just used to the idea that there is a certain type of social behavior that will keep it at bay and in silence. But it's not a new situation. But it's interesting because, for example, because I do a lot of clinical work connected to spaces that have to do with political militancy, it ends up that I either have patients or I work close to people who know that I'm an analyst, and then they look for analysts who are around me. And I think it's a common problem for every place that's trying to establish psychoanalysis. That to establish psychoanalysis, you need to create a common space of people who take seriously and believe that there is something being thought in that practice. But at the very moment that you're creating this, because of the current status of the practice, you also need to institute a separation between the practicing analysts and the community that they depend on for that practice to exist, that is almost negating the thing you relied on to develop. So I think this is a very deep question. And the reason why I think it's a deep question also is because that, to go back to transference as a problem, I see in Brazil, I'm not sure if we had the chance to talk about this before, but in Brazil, there is something very special that shows how far the issue of the common space in the community can affect the clinical space, not only in the sense of information that circulates, but also in the level of effectivity of transference and interpretation. We went through a dictatorship in Brazil from the 60s to the 80s. And like some Latin American countries, but not most Latin American countries after dictatorships, they persecuted torturers. They put them in jail. They went after, murderers and so on. And in Brazil, we didn't go after anyone. There were no arrests of people who committed war crimes or crimes during the dictatorship connected to state violence. So there was a very big movement in the 90s, and it goes on to today, of dealing with, first, creating what we've called a truth commission, where people can come to a space that is juridically organized, testify about what they went through, to start building cases against torturers, against the military personnel who murdered so many people. Well, psychoanalysis has been of great help and has been greatly involved with this process, because it also established itself in Brazil during the dictatorship. And the idea that it had a different relationship to the world and to subjectivity rather than the dictatorship was actually an important part of how analysts conceived their political lives. But what happened is that a lot of people who spend years and years in private analysis after the dictatorship, dealing with their traumas, dealing with what they went through, when they went to testify in the Truth Commission, as it's called, felt like their traumas hadn't been touched by analysis at all. As if something had just been kind of as a foreign body, as Freud says, right? A foreign body just waiting. And their private lives, their libidinal connections to their family, to their peers, to their work, in their love life, all of those things were transformed. But when they were in front of that commission to testify about torture and about what they went through, they felt inhibited. They felt that they were before another that was over-determining them in a way they couldn't understand. They felt very anxious. And this problem was posed. Why is it that private analysis, even for many people, for many years, didn't touch on these things? And a new clinic was created called Testimony Clinic. It's been going on for more than a decade, I think quite a lot more, which is a different clinic. What's the difference? It's simply a clinic that is stated before you start your analysis that it also deals with state violence, that type of trauma exists, and it's not reducible to whatever you went through. It's not interpretable in terms of the state is not your father, pretty much. Not the same thing. And people who go there, they do end up working through things that they didn't manage to work through in a clinical process just with a regular analyst, even though it looks like the process is the same. Meaning it's not a collective analysis, it's not a group analysis, it's not a psychodrama. Most of these analysts are Lacanian. So what changed? What's the difference between the testimony clinic and the regular clinical practice that one would be able to affect something and the other wouldn't? The difference, as I see it, has to do with that common space, has to do with being able to bear as a community, right, to institute that there is something to be listened to in certain reference, in certain signifiers, and that they're not just metonymies or metaphors to some familial drama. I don't think we have a theory to explain what that is exactly, but it just goes to show that there is something about this underlying type of relation that is established in a community that can very well seep into the level of effectivity that interpretation can have. And I do find it important that it's not analysans qua analysans that create the clinic of testimony. It's analysts who feel they are traversed by that problem, that socio-historical problem of the dictatorship. That's why they created this. So they, in a certain way, institute a space that is framed by certain problems that not necessarily every clinical practice is framed by. And by adding that frame, some things can both be listened to and intervened upon in a way that is different. So this is just to show that there is actually a very deep connection, a very mysterious connection still. I don't think it's understandable. It's not clear right now. That relates the issue of access, the issue of the really existing bonds that connect the people who make up the analytic community, and what happens inside the clinical space, and the capacity of that clinical space, regardless of the analyst's personal talent as an analyst, because of course, the private analysis of all these people included interpretations, punctuations, an interest in what they went through. They spoke of the dictatorship. They spoke of torture and everything. And that didn't change anything. So it's not the particular analyst's capacity that is at stake. So it just goes to show how these issues are very, very connected, and how much we still have to do, I think. How wide the road, ahead is. There's a lot of things to think through from that perspective, I think.
Thank you, it's interesting. In fact, he touched on something that has to do with the professional identity of the analyst, or something that might identify the analyst as more or less successful one. And this interestingly correlates with the problematic nature of psychoanalysis created by Freud. Because as we know from Freud's point of view, psychoanalysis is not something that requires to be talented for, or something that requires a skill that is fundamentally dependent on what the subject is as a whole. Analysis instead is something that works as long as the subject has enough ability not to interfere with the process. That's why, from the analyst, this Freud's thought was picked up in communities in a particular way. It played to the community's advantage for the reason that there emerged a possibility of reproduction here. The reproduction of analysts as opposed to the production of scientists, for example, of those involved in arts or sports, is possible precisely because there is a certain framework, including the institutional one, enabling the reproduction of the analyst from almost any human material, provided that he or she follows certain rules, or its technical realization that could be interpreted differently in different communities. As a rule, there is usually a consensus that is captured by the newcomers quite quickly. Apparently, we're talking about the institutional hypothesis of the analyst's reproduction, which, as far as I understand, we don't have to share today. I mean, it's not about an analyst who is so obedient to the community's professional norms that she doesn't risk spoiling anything in the analysis by letting the analysis as such work. Rather, allowing the analysis to continue precisely because the analyzing subject, the analyst herself, doesn't interfere, as she doesn't interfere, say, in some subjective processes, which is why we hear all the time that the analyst doesn't give advice or guide anyone. Apparently, it doesn't refer only to the notion of strict neutrality, but also to what she called one of the features of conservatism inherent to analysis. Clearly, something protective impacts here. These are the very conventions that should rather not be challenged. It's very likely that allowing the analysis to keep this sort of configuration is what limits it. So there emerges a need for some other kind of analysis that wouldn't be the analysis of classical communities, because it cannot analyze what you mentioned as a very specific suffering, a very specific, apparently unanalyzable experience. Most likely, we're on the verge of reinventing or redefining the analyzing subject. I mean, apparently this subject cannot be, at least not in all parts of analysis, in all its regions, cannot be organized as it's organized in terms of community and in terms of the norms that were actually forged during Freud's lifetime. The peak of this forging was in the 30s, when a great number of rules, regulations, and almost casuistic interpretations of what the analyst is allowed to do or what she has to refrain from appeared. We know that these traditions are still alive today. For example, the School of French Somatic Analysis pays great attention to the bodily movements of the analyst during the session. It's literally said that the analyst is not allowed to get up, to drink water, to walk around the office or the room where she is conducting the session. That is, among other things, the frame must be held together by the immobility, by the frame of the analyst's own body, which is the setting. But apparently, when the question is put in this way and there emerges the casuistry of various complex prohibitions, which you analyze under the name of the political is overlooked. In other words, is a certain way of not asking about the political, or not asking about things that don't get into analysis, or even being present, are not registered. Because politics is again the question of access and the availability of knowledge, among other things, both in the sense Lacan uses this term, and perhaps in the sense of a certain publicity or disclosure of what can be discussed, even if it happens at the level of the act of enunciation, rather than the content of the signifiers used. Therefore, I gladly agree with the most of what you have said. Yes, and I want to thank all the participants. Thank you also for the opportunity to speak.
Yes, thank you, Alexander. And I'm afraid we are running out of time. So if Gabriel, just some final short speech and yeah.
Well, as I said in the beginning, and I think I had the opportunity to mention other times that we got a chance to engage and to talk. I really, I mean, I'm very happy that the book has brought us all together. But I know also that the book is just an excuse, because clearly we could have these conversations before the book as well, because there is a bigger, I think, movement happening. There is a very interesting emergence in many places of a similar conversation, which I think is different everywhere, but it's also very surprising in how it points to common problems across very different contexts. And I think that it is also hopefully an opportunity for us to bring together these different places, because my experience until now is that if people who are interested in psychoanalysis, either because they're undergoing analysis or they work as analysts, but they're not that connected from this intellectual side of publishing or writing books or things, that they tend to feel very isolated, as if these conversations are destined to be the stuff of private encounters with their friends, small groups, or something like this, as if the analytic establishment is totally impervious to this. And it creates, I think, a danger, which is the impression that only if you achieve a certain level of public debate, you get to see that this is happening everywhere and that there are many of such conversations. I think that a big challenge moving forward now is to create these types of conversations at the level where most of the interested parties are, which is not necessarily at the level of writing books and discussing book publications and so on, but at the level of these conversations that are very relevant to the analytic practice itself. I think it's often not mentioned how much of the analytic community and the analytic connections, the connections between analysts, is responsible for lowering the anxiety of clinical practice to a bearable size. And I think that there is therefore a correlation between connecting with other people who are discussing the same problems and managing to experiment in your own clinical practice with your hypotheses. So beyond the very important and very generous reception that the book has been having, thanks to all of you here, I also think that hopefully we won't, stop there, and we can continue to work together and discuss these things, and also try to bring more of that effect of lowering the general level of anxiety of facing these blind spots and these open questions for more people. So again, thank you so much. Really, it was a pleasure.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for joining us together. And I share all the words that you said. I do think that these are important issues, and they have to be brought up, and they have to be discussed publicly. And it is especially valuable that now we can get connected between two absolutely separate parts of the world. And thank you again for joining us today. And I hope we will see you soon again, so we can discuss some other stuff.
Definitely.
Thanks, it was great.
Thank you. See you soon.